And yeah, take it away, Grace.
Thank you so much. And thanks for Open Democracy for hosting this. I'm really excited to be able to be here to have this discussion with Cristina Flesher Fominaya, who is the author of the most recent book. Her most recent book is Democracy Reloaded: Inside Spain's Political Laboratory from 15N to Podemos, along with many other books. And she is the editor-in-chief of the journal Social Movement Studies. I'm really excited to be here because she also contributed an essay to my most recent edited collection, Futures of Socialism, which was a really fantastic essay. And that's kind of how I came to know her work, which has actually been really useful for me in kind of coming to understand a bit about both Spanish political economy, but also, I think the frame that she has of this idea of the kind of movement party, which I hope we can talk about a bit today, is really interesting and useful for kind of understanding a lot of the tensions that we've seen within all these kind of, broadly speaking, democratic socialist or left populist movements that have sprung up over the last 10 years. So we're gonna talk about Spain, but I also hope that we can have a little bit of a discussion about the lessons from Cristina's work that can be applied to other movements all around the world. So thank you so much for joining me, Cristina. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thanks so much, Grace, for interviewing me today. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Grace said, we met when I collaborated on her book of essays, Futures of Socialism. And thanks also, of course, to Open Democracy for hosting this. I've been writing for Open Democracy for many years now, so I'm really happy to be also participating in their webinar series. And of course, thank you to everybody for joining us.
Right, so
Oh, sorry, I wanted, before I forget, because I will forget once we start talking, I just wanted to tell people, if you are interested in getting the book, if you use a code, which is ASFLYQ6, and maybe somebody can put that in the chat, you can get a 30% off the paperback. So it brings it down quite a lot. But if that's still too steep, I just also wanted to let people know that one of the longest and juiciest chapters on the camp is open access on the Oxford University Press site. So you can read it for free there if you're interested. So I just wanted to pass that on before we get stuck into our conversation.
Well, there you go. Little did you know that in logging onto this webinar, you would be given 30% off a brilliant book that is absolutely worth reading. So you're very lucky. It's great to see everyone posting in the chat where they're coming from. We've got lots of people from all over the world. So do continue to post where you are from in the chat. And also, as we go on, do post your questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and we'll come to those towards the end of our discussion. So I am going to open with my questions now. I've got quite a few, but we'll see how we go, and hopefully we can just have a kind of informal discussion and then bring in some audience questions as well.
Sure.
So can you start by just talking to us a bit about the protests that erupted in Spain in 2011, the so-called kind of movements of the squares, and the movements that emerged out of this?
Sure. I think maybe one of the ways I can do that is to explain a little bit what I do in the book, because that helps me kind of put together the narrative. So one of the things that inspired me to write the book was a puzzle. I like to work with puzzles. So one of the puzzles was thinking through, what does it mean to live in what is ostensibly a democracy, and to see a mass movement that's demanding real democracy now? Because we can understand people demanding democracy if they live in an authoritarian regime, but what does it mean to demand real democracy now if you are living in a democracy already? So that brings us to kind of the puzzle, or the state of Western liberal democracies, which has this really interesting paradox, which is that people's satisfaction with democracy keeps going down, but their commitment to democracy as a value is really, really strong. So that tension kind of opened up my way of looking into this movement and thinking about the movement. And the other thing I wanted to figure out was, how did this movement emerge and how was it so strong? And obviously, context is really important here. So on the one hand, we do have this sort of crisis of legitimation of democracy. But on the other hand, we had, of course, a massive crisis, global financial crash that was leading to austerity politics and creating a context. So it's kind of within that framework then that we have a mobilization of pre-existing networks that have kind of been active for many years, but we're kind of at a lower level of mobilization, start to feel increasingly frustrated by the situation, angered by austerity politics, and also starting to get really inspired by things like Snowden, things like Tahrir in Egypt, things like the pots and pans revolution in Iceland. And so they started to kind of converge and talk to each other and started setting up these assemblies to meet and see what can we do, what can we do? And really this feeling like we have to do something. The situation is so critical, we have to do something. And that's kind of where this movement emerges, from these pre-existing networks that get together and decide that they're gonna hold a rally, because there was no original intention to have a camp. It was going to be a protest march on the 15th of May, which is where the movement gets its name, 15M. Mm. So that's kind of just in a nutshell, setting the scene, really.
Movements like 15M have kind of been characterized and often actually dismissed by political scientists as, you know, manifestations of populism. And often this comes down to a kind of horseshoe theory where populism of the left and populism of the right are kind of seen as basically, you know, the same. Do you think that's in any way a useful way of understanding what's been happening in Spain over the last decade?
Not really, no. I think it's I don't think it's very useful at all. I mean, populism is a term, there is some limited use to it. I mean, as a concept, as a political science concept, but it's a very limited use, and it's, you know, it's very basic, really. I don't think it does a lot to explain mass pro-democracy movements and how these movements emerge, how they sustain themselves, the kind of power they have to transform democracy. It throws in the same pot, you know, anti-democratic, fascist, racist movements with really progressive pro-democracy movements, and decides to call them all populism because they're all grassroots movements that are speaking in the name of the people and have, you know, problems with an elite. What grassroots movement historically, a progressive grassroots movement, hasn't had a problem with the elite and hasn't tried to mobilize people around a shared set of common concerns? And calling them populist doesn't really get us very far, I don't think, you know, in capturing that. 15M is coming from a tradition of movement mobilizing, in autonomous movement mobilizing. And that's what I spend a lot of time explaining in the book, what that is and how that works. But that autonomous logic is what enables 15M to become this mass movement, along with other factors that obviously facilitated that.
Can you talk a little bit more about this idea of the autonomous movement and the problems and challenges, but also the kind of opportunities that are presented by this new form of kind of leaderless organizing, and also, yeah, kind of where many of those movements that were structured around this idea of the autonomous movement and the leaderless organization have ended up?
Well, I think that they're not new, right? I mean, these movements have been around for a really long time. Pro-democracy, autonomous movements have always taken internal democracy really seriously, because they understand that hierarchies are oppressive. And so they are based around prefigurative politics. And what that means is trying to act within your group and within your communities in a way that challenges and rejects the status quo, which is based on power, hierarchy, and oppression and inequality. So these movements have always struggled in different ways with how you do that in the best way. And there's a lot of different strands of autonomy, right? So there's feminist strands of autonomy, there's squatting strands, there's more workerist strands, depending on the different countries. But they all have some kind of basic things in common, or some basic principles. Direct action is one, like try to try to do unmediated politics. You try to do as least mediated politics as possible, if that makes sense. You try to have a non-hierarchical organization within your organizations and your groups. So they're against hierarchy, so they're usually leaderless, although that's not really true, because all groups de facto have charismatic leadership and they have people who take the lead on different things, but they strive to not be organized in a vertical way. And they're really against like membership and the idea of fixed acronyms or commitment, frozen orthodoxies. They really reject all of that. So it's very much a practical principle. It draws a lot from anarchist principles as well, but also feminist principles of self-care, working around the common. So there's all kinds of different manifestations, but that kind of gives you a sense of what kind of politics or what kind of political framework autonomous movements operate in.
One thing I think that a kind of debate, I suppose, that's been going on the left for quite a long time, and has really become much more acute over the last 10 years, has been this debate, I suppose, between there was that book that came out a while ago from Nick Cernacek and Dan Williams that talked about this idea of folk politics, right? That the left had been too concerned with folk politics, with these kind of non-hierarchical ways of organizing that focused on direct action, and there needed to be a kind of a utopian strand brought back into left ways of organizing, but also a reorientation towards kind of the acquisition of state power. Now, obviously, this has a very particular resonance in the Spanish case, given the links between 15M and a political party, Podemos, that ultimately ended up actually moving into the state. So I was wondering if you could kind of reflect on those debates. And I suppose, you know, they go up and down so much with fashion, basically. When the Corbyn and Sanders and Podemos and, you know, Syriza projects were at their peak, there is this, you know, real push to say, no, the left needs to focus on electoralism and state power. And then when those fail, we kind of revert back to the kind of opposite of that. So I'm wondering what your read is on that.
Well, there's been a really interesting, one of the most interesting developments for me. I mean, I've been active in this movement network for over 20 years. So during the global justice movement, that's really when I started being, well, actually before that, but anyway, the last wave of protest was the global justice movement, where I started being active in autonomous movements in Madrid. So for me, it was really, really interesting to come back, you know, several years later, in 2011, to see the same autonomous networks, but something had changed. So what had changed? One of the things that had changed was what I call the democratic turn. And so before I was talking about how these parties had always been really concerned with internal democracy, but what we see with 15M is they start being concerned with external democracy. In other words, they start mobilizing discursively and also actively to reclaim democratic institutions for the citizens. So it's not just about me and my group being democratic and not being hierarchical and not being sexist and not being racist. It's about me actually trying to mobilize people that aren't in my group and mobilize society and convince society that first, people power can make a difference, which is the hardest thing to convince people of anywhere, because we're programmed not to think that that's possible. We're always programmed to think that we should delegate politics to representatives in liberal democracies and to leaders, and other people know best and other people are experts and so on and so forth. So that democratic turn was really about reclaiming institutions. And so in a sense, that also opens the door, ultimately, although initially there was a lot of resistance, but it ultimately helps open the door to thinking, well, there's reclaiming the institutions for the citizens, and then there's another step, which is, well, maybe we should be in the institutions. Maybe we should take a turn representing and being politicians in this institution. So that definitely was something that I really noticed as somebody who had been involved in the networks for a long time. It really, really struck me, was like, this is about democracy. This is about reloading democracy, taking back democracy, which I think, initially was not so clear. Yes, the slogan was real democracy now, but the manifesto, was a mishmash of all kinds of demands for, how all of these kind of negotiated manifestos are. You have something on the environment, and you've got something about the economy, and you've got something about austerity, and so on and so forth. So it would be easy to kind of get lost in all the millions of issues that kind of get slotted into the movement. But if you kind of take a step back, you see that really what this is about is transforming democracy. And that all of these other issues, the route to transforming them is to shifting our way of thinking about how we participate in politics and who politics are for, why do politics exist, who are they supposed to be representing, and who are they actually representing, and so on.
I really, really like this this focus that you're placing on democracy and trying to bring back democracy into understanding, not just of kind of party politics, but also of much wider social systems in which we find ourselves. So both talking about the state and like wider society, and also the economy. I want though to talk a little bit more about this idea that I mentioned that I was interested in at the beginning of the talk, which is this idea of the movement party, which you also talk about in the essay that you wrote for my book. Can you explain what this means and how this relates to Podemos, to 15M, and to Spanish political economy?
Sure. So a movement party, or a hybrid party, is a party that seeks to maintain links to social movements while still being firmly committed to winning elections. So it wants to kind of integrate some of the characteristics of social movements, but at the same time, it wants to be committed to winning elections. So the Greens in Germany, for example, were a movement party. Podemos is another movement party. The Five Star Movement in Italy, they're all really different forms of movement party. And they each have their own peculiar characteristics. But what kind of ties them together is this idea that their legitimacy and their origin stories are rooted in the movements. They really want to maintain that links with the movements, and they also want to have some of that participatory characteristics within the party, in theory anyway, and especially initially. Then what happens later is a different story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, can we talk about that a little bit? Because obviously democracy kind of within Podemos has been the subject of some contention, I think it's fair to say. And perhaps that the party is not as democratic as many as its founders hoped, and as perhaps the kind of spirit of those movements that you were discussing at the start might suggest. So can you tell us a little bit about what's happened there, and what lessons you've drawn from that experience?
Well, it's a complicated story, and in the book I spend a lot of time sort of blow by blow explaining exactly what happened from the origin of the party to kind of roughly where we are now. And I do it from the perspective of movement activist critiques and people who were in the party's own critiques of the party. So I wasn't interested in kind of standing outside and just criticizing the party, but I really wanted to understand what the people who had been really passionate about the party felt had gone wrong, and kind of trace the different debates and internal debates within the party. So that's quite a complicated story. But I think sort of encapsulating or speaking a little bit in soundbite, if you will, there were some very unfortunate decisions taken to opt for control over democracy consistently. And to be fair, there was legitimate fear, I think, in the beginning of loss of control. You're talking about the most audacious party formation you can imagine. I mean, it's like 5 people and their friends, you know, starting this party. And in the Spanish context, there's always been a real history and a real problem with leftist parties trying to take over movement spaces and trying to colonize particular political projects. So it was a real fear that losing control of the party at the local level would kind of end the party before it had even been able to begin, right? So initially, there was really a threat of having party control slip when the party was still in its infancy. The other thing is that you're talking about this incredibly participatory movement, right? Where there's a million circles and anybody can create their own circle and anybody can talk about, you know, their issue and make their circle about whatever they want. It could be sectorial, it could be, you know, fans of Star Trek. I'm just, you know, there was like one like that, but it's kind of a joke one. But what I'm saying is,
that's brilliant.
You know, it's like anything goes, right? And when a new party is born, it's a blank canvas. And blank canvases really attract also people just projecting their desires and their fantasies and their issues onto it, right? But at some point, the party needs to start defining itself. And there was no infrastructure in place really for them to effectively channel so many different issues. Now, does that mean that you just ignore all the circles, you don't seek a way of channeling that, and you just make a presidential party? Well, no. So I think they really went over way too much over to the presidentialist side. But it was a gradual process, and it was also sadly the result of internal struggles and factionalism, where power plays basically, and each time that would happen, you would lose a part of the party, and you would lose human capital. You'd lose really great people. So over time, it's just really kind of gotten narrower and narrower and smaller. And sadly, its electoral fortunes have also gone down, basically. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, I think there might be if there's a long silence, that's why. So another kind of question that we have is about the relationship between kind of party democracy and political parties that end up gaining electoral power. Now, internal party democracy often ends up coming up against pressure from the state. And actually, in Spain's case, from the European Union, there may be kind of demands that emerge from within the party or a movement linked to a party, which are then state apparatus by kind of international apparatuses. And then, you have this often very difficult internal question as to how to manage these competing demands. I mean, I certainly think that's been the case in the UK Labour Party even before before Corbyn came close to state power. There was this very serious push in the media for saying things like open selection were Stalinist purges, and that any attempt to get any level of real democracy within the Labour Party was giving the kind of, mentalist control over the asylum or any other kind of horrific trope that the British press uses with such ease. So I guess I'm wondering is, do you think it's possible for a democratic movement party to survive a collision of one kind or another with state power?
Well, I mean, it can survive, but whether or not, the problem is that unless you win, unless you win the election by a landslide, like, Franklin Delano Roosevelt or something, you can't go in and just start doing whatever you want when you get into, even if you get into parliament, and even if you get into government, as they now finally are in government. But it's a balancing act between keeping those gestures and openness to the progressive wing of your electorate and to your activist base, but also being able to be savvy enough to get some wins that you can point to as successes. So you can demonstrate that you're actually doing something positive. I mean, you're right though, because you're mentioning a really important factor here, which is the media. So it's not just state power sort of that's pushing back. It's the media. It's the constant media onslaught of demonization and dismissal. And I mean, we've just had in Spain a few days ago, you know, leaks of generals saying that, you know, Podemos and the socialists are, you know, basically leading everybody into hell, and there has to be an intervention from the military, and just endless nonsense that is really, really hard to deal with. So it's exhausting and it's debilitating, and that's exactly what it's designed to do. So all these, well, Corbyn had the same thing, you know, all this anti-Semitic, you know, accusations of anti-Semitism and this kind of thing, and then the press gets involved and they try to paint him like some kind of, you know, it's very debilitating and it's very exhausting, and it's really hard when you're fighting on all fronts and you don't necessarily have that power. But I think that it's easier to handle if you manage to maintain that connection, that close to net connection to a movement base. And I think that what ends up happening too often is that the movement parties, when they get electoral success, they forget about their activist base and they think about just the electoral game, right? Just making electoral win. And they also start thinking too much about themselves. So I think that in the case of Podemos, certainly, and Labor probably, they spend too much time fussing about their internal affairs and talking about their internal affairs in public. And most people don't care about their internal affairs. Most people care about how they're going to make their bills this month and what have you done for me lately. And unfortunately, parties forget, you know, parties forget about that. They get caught up in this game of politics and they lose contact. So I think movement parties that are successful in maintaining that link to the activist base can weather, I think, those storms more effectively than the ones who just kind of cut free of the movement base and try and just win, because they're always going to be in the sights, I don't know how you say, and like in the sights of the guns of everybody in society who doesn't want them, these powerful interests who don't want progressive change. They don't want an increased social welfare state. They don't want, you know, progressive politics. So yeah, it's a really difficult balancing act. But I think, so just to take one lesson back from there, I think Podemos spent too much time fussing about its internal problems and airing its laundry in public, and not enough time really making hay out of the real concrete achievements that they made, like raising the minimum wage, which is obviously something that immediately has a huge effect on millions of people's well-being. So yeah, I think that Grace has frozen.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi thing really terrible. So
That's okay. I'll wait for you to come back.
Ooh, I think we've lost Grace there temporarily. I'm sorry about this.
Okay.
Hopefully she should rejoin us in
You
a
want to feed me a
moment.
question maybe from people?
Yeah, but in the meantime, I'm going to just look at some of the questions we've had come in so far, and there've been quite a few interesting ones. First of all, somebody has asked earlier on about the role of populism. I'm just going to. Oh, perhaps Grace is back in. Hey, Grace.
Oh, there we go.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what.
That's okay.
My internet suddenly went appalling, and I wasn't hearing you properly, so I tried to fix it, and it completely crashed. But hopefully, we will. We will. It will not happen again.
I'll let you continue, Grace.
Yeah, you just got to the end of that question actually, and the thing that I was going to ask you is, you were talking about the importance of kind of having these links maintained between different areas of the party and the movement, and I'm wondering kind of what examples can you give us of structures, of democratic structures, of kind of institutional structures that have been used successfully to maintain that link while allowing parties to kind of develop policy and actually kind of do the things that parties do.
Well, I think the links to activism, to the activist base, I guess there's two different things, because one thing is your link to your activist base. And as I say, I think that the value of that and the importance of that has been really overlooked, and not only overlooked by Podemos, but also overlooked, I think, by scholars who are analyzing this. Because you have to understand that, especially initially, the wins that we saw in the municipal elections were a result of the incredible enthusiastic grassroots mobilization of thousands and thousands of people to make those elections completely different from any elections that had been before. And people involved in that were really important, and I talk about this in the book as well, are the movements for graphic liberation of Madrid and the movement for graphic liberation of Barcelona, who used autonomous networking principles to crowdsource and tap into their networks so much energy for people to create videos, posters, blog posts, every kind of thing, and just they papered the city with campaigns that looked nothing like traditional campaigns. All electoral campaigns always look exactly the same. Some headshot, some vacuous slogan, and then the party logo, and then they just all are stuck on a wall, right? And you don't even notice them, right? And these were all these beautiful representations with a weird twist, because they were very much designed around charismatic leadership of the two women, actually, who were running for mayor. So there is a bit of a contradiction there with autonomous politics, but it was a very interesting combination. My point, though, is that without that grassroots activist mobilization, you don't get Barcelona going to Ada Colau, don't get Madrid going to Ahora Madrid and Manuela Carmena. And those are huge cities. I mean, you're talking about progressive politics at a massive scale of the two largest cities in Spain, and economies as well that are big. So that enabled them then to implement all kinds of progressive politics, to redesign the city centers, to start greening and reclaiming the energy for the city, so it's not private, and making it public again in Barcelona. So many different politics came out of that thanks to the movement. But the other side of that, and that goes back to something you were saying before, is that you can't kind of just talk about participation and expect people to be on board with that being a good thing. You need that movement, you need that pro-democracy movement to convince the public that, in fact, it is a good thing. And then so what the movement did, what the 15M movement did, and what Podemos did, and what all the other municipalist movements for change, not just Podemos, is that they convinced people, they managed to rewrite the narrative about austerity, but they also managed to rewrite the narrative about democracy. and they got people to really think about democracy in a completely different way. And to think that they should have a role in that democracy shouldn't just be voting every 4 years, that there should be more to it, and that it could be something that served citizen needs and answered citizen needs. So they were redesigning politics, right? But you were going back to the institutions, you were saying, what can they do when they get in? One of the things they did do in both cities is to set up more participatory democratic organs within the government. And interestingly, the one in Madrid still exists, even though it's now under a right-wing government. So you can see there's some lasting change there. In Madrid, it's called Decide Madrid, and in Barcelona, it's Decidim Madrid, but it just means decide, we decide. And they're participatory portals that enable citizens to put proposals and vote on proposals and for things at the city level, at the municipal level. So those kinds of tweaks can be done. But there's a lot of pluses and minuses about that too. It's very complex. I mean, I think people simplistically think that if you just have more participation, that's enough. But I don't think that's actually the case. There's been examples of where more participation doesn't necessarily lead to more progressive politics. You have to have a movement that convinces people that progressive politics are the way to go for that to pay off, because otherwise more participation can just as easily lead to Trump or fascism or,
I suppose linked to that, and something that I think is, is certainly of interest to me and is becoming kind of more mainstream in recent years, has been how we extend these ideas around democracy beyond kind of democratizing political parties and democratizing the state into how do we democratize the economy. And I think that also hinges on another question, which is to do with what links can be built between these kind of movementist parties and just movements and more traditional sources of left power, like the labor movement as well, in thinking about how we democratize the economy.
I don't know if I have so much to say about that. I think it's really, I think a lot about political culture, and that's what I also study, is sort of the cultural and the narrative and the discourses and the ways of doing politics. That's always been what I've been interested in. And I think that it's tricky because, I mean, if you go back to Podemos, what enabled Podemos to present itself as the anti-politics, right? The only way you can do that is if you don't have links to traditional established politics, left or right. And in Spain, and I would imagine this is the case in several countries, old established unions, for example, often have very hierarchical structure, often have very close and intimate relationships with government parties and established parties, and sometimes also have corruption scandals as well. And this was certainly the case in Spain. So it's tricky to cozy up too immediately to established leftist institutions if you're presenting yourself as neither left nor right, totally new, not associated with anybody. Which initially, that's obviously not how Podemos is perceived or presents today, but initially that was the key to the movement's success, and it was the key to Podemos' success. To be able to convince people that anybody could be a part of that movement, anybody could vote for that party. So the initial support and vote did not just come from the left. The initial support and vote came from left and right. I know I'm getting off the topic of your original.
No, that's a really important point, actually, and it wasn't something that I really knew about. So that's good.
So I say in the book, and I still think it's the case, Podemos resisted for a really long time a lot of pressure to form an alliance with Izquierda Unida, which is the federal leftist party. I still maintain that it's the biggest mistake they ever made. They finally caved. I don't know why. I really genuinely don't know why. Pablo Iglesias changed his mind. He caved because he was completely against it for a really long time, for exactly the reasons that I'm saying. And ever since they did that, they have never, their electoral votes have just gone down and down. They've never recovered from associating with the old, because, you know, a lot of people see that as the old dinosaur left, if you're even somewhat sympathetic to it, or if you're a right-wing person or you're more towards the right, you perceive it as, you know, you go back to the Civil War and all the old deep cleavages in Spain, and then everything just gets interpreted again on this left and right pole, which 15M managed to, for a brief period, it actually managed to transcend that cleavage. And that was the most remarkable thing about the movement. I mean, you're talking about a movement that mobilized millions of citizens, and that even a year after it exploded in the camps, was still pulling 70% acceptance from the public opinion surveys for their demands, which is remarkable. I mean, movements don't get that kind of sympathy usually. They don't. Movements don't even come close to that level of public opinion. So it's really a remarkable moment. And it obviously had a tremendous long-lasting effect on the political landscape, for good and for bad. But, you know, yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions from the audience now. And there's one here which I think is quite interesting. Could the speaker talk about the regional question within Podemos, the fact that the party and much of 15M emerged in Madrid, and the experience of the protest and resistance in other regions are very different? Podemos has had some internal regional tensions to manage. Do you think that this is a particularly important issue in Spain, more so than other countries? That's from Coldo Kassler. I'll let you come back to that, and then I'll present you with some more.
Oh, okay. Well, regional politics are always incredibly important in Spain. Again, like I said, well, I was saying before, with 15M, it was really amazing that even in Barcelona and Catalonia, in fact, in the square, in the camp in Catalonia, there was a real clear steer not to mix independent nationalist politics in with the 15M movement in the square, which is very interesting. And again, short-lived, as we've seen, because obviously pro-independence movement has come back with an absolute vengeance, right? But that's responsible to a lot of complicated things. In Spain, regional tensions are always important. I think within Podemos itself, it has been important, but I don't think that the problems that we see regionally are just to do with regional politics. I think that they manifest that way, but they're really struggles for power and a struggle for autonomy in the regions, which is regional, I guess, yeah, versus the central control of the party cupola and the central organizing body. And unfortunately, those divisions have caused, you know, the excision of very important people who were very charismatic, like Teresa Rodriguez in Andalusia. So there have been splits there regionally that have really left the party much weaker, I think. But regional politics in Spain is always a huge, huge issue. Yeah.
Well, yeah, everywhere, even in the UK.
Yes.
There's a question here from Miguel Martinez. Podemos as a movement party, perhaps it was in the beginning for some 15M activists who joined the circles, but it was clear that they were a party and not a movement, and even that the party did not want to represent the movement. All this seems very different from, say, the German Greens. Why then stretch the definition of party movement to include Podemos?
Right. I think I would say that, yes, I think a lot of people today looking at Podemos would, activists especially, as Miguel has just said, would say, no, this is not a movement party. This is a presidentialist party. And I've even heard people say that it's the least democratic party in Spain. So, I mean, you know, and I think that those critiques are valid. On the other hand, I think certainly initially it's a movement party. All of its legitimacy, discourse, narrative base came from the movement. Their sources of legitimacy to convince people to join were the roots of the party and the 15M movement, the guarantee and incorporation of key movement demands into their manifesto and their agenda, which are still there. So they're still representing the movement in that sense. They still have a manifesto and an agenda that represent many key demands in the movement. The activist credentials of the leadership, which are uncontestable. You can hate them, like them, think they're sellouts, but their activist histories are there for all to see, and they go back 20 years in many cases or more. And they also continue to be, especially I would say, Ione Belarra, who is one of the secretaries in the party. She also is an activist, and her entire commitment is to contacting, mobilizing, representing social movements of all kinds. And I think that there still is that desire amongst a lot of people in the party to keep the movements and the movement agendas, you know, to pay attention to them and to try and represent them and to try to channel them. And I think they still do that. So even if their own internal democracy is not anything like the movement that it spawned it, I think you can still talk about it as a movement party for those reasons. But I totally accept that there would be people who would just say that's ridiculous because, you know, they're just acting like any other party now.
There's another question here. To explain Podemos's choice to build an alliance with Izquierda Unida, don't we need to bear in mind that Ciudadanos emerged as an alternative to PSOE and PP from the centre at the same time, and therefore Podemos needed to redefine itself as a clear alternative on the left, and Izquierda Unida was there already. There was no room for the two of them.
No, I don't buy that. Sorry. it's a good
solid answer.
But I don't think that's it. I think what was happening was there was a misreading of the reason that the municipal elections worked. So because the municipal elections were alliances and coalition lists that went forward, even though Podemos was like a very big, important part of those, but there were many other actors involved, many movement actors involved. And that process is called confluencia. So people really believed that the key to win, the reason that those elections had been so successful had been because of these alliances. And because they were so incredibly successful, then the party began to just be battered and battered and battered with people saying, confluencia, 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 this is what we have to do, this is what we have to do. And there are a lot of people in the movement who had been Izquierda Unida party members for many years and who wanted to see their old party incorporated into this new thing and to finally have success. You're talking about a party that was getting 3% of the, you know, if they were lucky at the time that this is happening. Izquierda Unida was not you know, yes, it gets a certain amount of votes, but it was a very non-successful party at the time that we're talking about. And I think that the pressure just became the pressure from so many people that this was the formula, that this was the way, that this was what was going to be successful. I think he finally gave in, and I think it was was a terrible mistake. I don't think they've ever recovered from that, because from then on it was like, oh, you said you were new, but really you're just the same old leftists dressed up in a new outfit, you know? So, but it's a good theory.
Final question here. How would Cristina relate the movement party to Joe Freeman's idea of the tyranny of structurelessness? In both Podemos and municipal platforms like Ahora Madrid, you have this void of mediating structures between core leadership and base.
I think that's an interesting theory too, but I think it's a bit of a stretch. I mean, Joe Freeman's argument was basically that you don't have any structures, not that you have too many vertical structures. So I think that what we're seeing is that you've got a vertical structure with very clear chain of command and very little internal democracy is what we're seeing. What Joe Freeman was talking about is when you have organizations that reject any kind of structure, but de facto have leadership, de facto have power imbalances that don't get addressed precisely because everybody's kind of pretending or assuming that they don't exist. So I think Freeman's argument is really, really different to a critique that we could make. I don't think there's structurelessness. I think it's very structured and probably too structured there, and not structured in a way that channels democratic participation from the base. Yeah, and there's all kinds of ironies and paradoxes that come out of that, which are really quite interesting, but yeah.
Seeing as you had such a quick answer to that, we'll get one more in.
Okay.
Is the change from movement party to presidential party inevitable with participation in the electoral system? From Suzanne Gannon.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. But I think that, I mean, it's always, if you could create a perfect experiment and tweak everything just the way you like it, you know, I don't think that they needed to do what they did, but in a way, I can also understand why they did what they did, which doesn't excuse it, but it does kind of make you understand it. I think it's worth also mentioning that what Podemos achieved was absolutely amazing. And however much we criticize them now, and however much we might be disappointed, and all the other things, which I can totally relate to, I think what they pulled off was absolutely remarkable. There has never been in Spanish democracy. I mean, they actually took us from a bi-party system to a multi-party system. Because they opened up that political space. And yes, we don't like it. Now we have extreme right. Yes, we have Ciudadanos. Yes, we have maybe things that we don't like. But what they actually managed to pull off was absolutely remarkable. And one of the keys to that we didn't talk about, and we don't really have so much time to talk about, but I talk about a lot in the book, was the media strategy. So Podemos's media strategy was absolutely key. And I have a quote here from Iglesias, recognizing the role of media and communication in Podemos. And he said this. He said, "What's the difference between a social expression and a political one? The machine. What is the Podemos machine? A party? No. The capacity to intervene in the media with a discourse that works. Everybody knows that the most important battles are fought in the media." And so the media story of Podemos is a long one, and I detail it a lot in the book. So on the one hand, I detail how they convinced activists to make that leap. And on the other hand, I also talk about their own development before 15M, through 15M, and after 15M, and detail the media strategy that really was crucial to their success and their ability to make that breakthrough, electoral breakthrough. So I think both of those aspects at the same time, mobilizing the activist base and also reaching the wide electorate through this really amazing media strategy.
Thank you so much for that, Cristina. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. I'm so glad we got the chance to have it. I'm going to hand back over to Adam now. I think, am I right in saying that this is going to be recorded and available online so we can share it for people who've not been able to see it?
Yes, this will be up on YouTube very shortly, and you will all get an email in your inboxes tomorrow. So if you'd like to watch this back, and thank you so much, Grace, for sharing, and thank you so much, Cristina, for coming along. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think that some of the tensions you talked about here between political movements and political parties can be sort of applied to a far wider context than was discussed. So I think, there's lots to take away from this discussion. And just want to once again remind everyone that Christina's book is out now, Democracy Reloaded, on Oxford University Press, and there is a 30% code off in the chat exclusively for you.
Right.
And I also wanted to have a quick plug and just say that we are also running we run these webinars every week, and there's a library of them to watch back on opendemocracy.net/live discussions. Next week, we'll be talking about freedom of information and why it's under attack, with our investigations editor, Peter Gagan, and some special guests. If you did like this discussion, you'd like to stay in touch, please sign up to our newsletter on opendemocracy.net/newsletter. And if you would like us to host more discussions like this, then please do support us if you can on opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you everyone for joining us, and special thanks to all our audience as well. We had such great comments and questions. And I hope you will join us again next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Christina.